Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing the 8 cognitive functions in your stack, and this is how it works for everybody. I'm going to be introducing my own terms that I like to use. It is a 8 function stack where the top 4 I'm going to be calling the ego, and the bottom 4 I'm going to be calling the shadow. This is inspired by Carl Jung's psychological types. It's inspired by Beebe's 8 function model, Lenore Thompson. It's inspired by Dave's superpowers. It's inspired by socionics. This is how I have come to see the way that these things work in my studies for 8 years. And so a lot of this stuff is probably going to sound familiar, but these are my own word choice that the way that I see these functions working. So the first function, which we might know of as the dominant function, I call the autopilot function. This is your default state of being. Your autopilot takes little to no energy to use. So this is what most of us identifies with. Our ego likes to identify it. It's often overinflated. Dave Superpowers talks about how we view this as like our savior. I call it the autopilot because you really just do it without thinking, to the point where you might not even realize that you're using it. That's how strong it is. Your second function, also called the auxiliary, is what I like to call the growth key. Any function that's in the growth key slot, when you intentionally lean on it, it will open doors to opportunity. And individuals who regularly use their growth key function and have worked to develop it will make better decisions and see more clearly. The reason for this is because, as Carl Jung says, no healthy person is purely extroverted or purely introverted. Also, no healthy person can make a sound judgment without also there being a sound perception. You can't see clearly if your judgments are ruining it as well. And so whether you're an introvert, an extrovert, a perceiver, or a judger, your top function is going to be one of each. And so it's going to leave the other sort of hanging. So for example, me as an ENFJ, I use extroverted feeling as my autopilot function. Without relying on NI for growth, which is why it's called the growth key, I'm only judging and I'm only extroverting. So how can I honestly make a sound judgment in the external world without making sure that my perception is fully calibrated and without taking time to introspect? So that's why the auxiliary function, even though it's easy to use, we view it as a perfect complement to our first function. It still needs to be leaned upon, because if not, our dominant function can become overinflated and we can be a little bit delusional about our judgments and our perceptions. The third function, also called the tertiary, I call the gilded coin. And the reason why I called it this was because we tend to either overly idealize this function, and we could be overeager when using it. There's something more than what meets the eye with the gilded coin. There's a lot to lose when cashing in on this function at inopportune times. So, because our tertiary is connected to our blind spot, our mental blind spot that I'll get into later, it's connected to it in the sense that it is of the same function, but a different orientation. So for example, my gilded coin is extroverted sensing, my mental blind spot is introverted sensing. Because I'm completely blind to the introverted world of sensing, I am going to think that I'm a lot better at sensing in the external world than I am, probably. And I might not even be thinking about the consequences of the sensing world, because I'm only looking at it from, sorry, this is a wasp. I'm only looking at it from an external point of view. Our gilded coin function can be used to assist our growth key function, but even though our ego likes to attach to this function, it's not necessarily something that we are super conscious of. So think about if your ego is attached to something, but you're not quite conscious of it, you are either going to overinflate your ability to do it, or you're going to like sort of idealize other people who use this function and not even realize when you're using it, or not take responsibility for when you use it. So that one's a tricky one. Okay, and so for the fourth function, also called the inferior, I call this one the diamond in the rough. And when a function is placed in the diamond in the rough, an individual will need to invest time and energy to truly see the value of that function. But once the work is done, you've hit the jackpot, and this is your gift to the world. So the inferior is the key. It's the other half of your autopilot. If you just, like if it was a diamond, imagine just tapping on it just a little tiny bit. You might not see that it's a diamond. It's a diamond in the rough. You have to work on it a little bit to grow and to balance out your overinflated autopilot function. But at first glance, we might not see the value, because it might seem like something that's opposite to us. We might realize that we're not very good at it, but it takes time to cultivate. It's not something that you're naturally good at. You tend to really admire people who are good at it, or perhaps want them to do it for you. We can go through phases of either being in the grip of it or like completely detached from it. But either way, you can't avoid it, because it's the other half of you. It essentially is you. FE and TI they reside on an axis, and you really can't have one without the other. You can't, and I'm using my own functions as an example, but you can't really create mutual benefit in the extroverted emotional world without thinking about your own discernment, without thinking about your own personal opinions. They really do go hand in hand, and that's why it's called the diamond in the rough, because as I mentioned, a lot of us overlook it. So now let's get into the shadow. So the shadow is the part of your psyche that prefers to remain in the subconscious. You might notice this in other people. Other people might point this out in you, and you might think that they're projecting, because you probably don't want anything to do with these functions. You probably notice how other people suck by using it, but God forbid anyone point out that you are guilty of this as well. That's how deep in the shadow and the subconscious it is. Oh my God, it's a freaking wasp. Hello. So the fifth function is the evil twin function, and this function is the opposite orientation, but the same function of your autopilot function. I'm going to have all these linked below in case you're curious the order. So for me, my evil twin function is introverted feeling. And so the evil twin function might feel like a devil on your shoulder rubbing up against your autopilot function. But be careful not to allow your evil twin to prevent you from finding your diamond in the rough. So the thing with the evil twin is that you might not really like to identify it, but its presence is undeniable. You feel it. You are always trying to squash it down. You view it as getting in your way. It's not autopilot in the sense that you don't do it without thinking, but it is just sort of naturally there, almost just as much as your dominant function. But you might even view it as evil sometimes. It's like Jekyll and Hyde sort of thing. FE and FI, for example, I have pretty easy access to my FI, but I'm not going to grab that tool nearly as often as my autopilot. But the thing to keep in mind is that your evil twin function, when I say be careful that it doesn't get in the way of your diamond in the rough, it is the opposite function, same orientation as your diamond in the rough. So for me, that would be FI as my evil twin and TI as my diamond in the rough. So if my FI is the antagonist to the TI, and so my FI doesn't like TI, and so it's this evil twin pretty much preventing me from going to my diamond in the rough. And we all have this little inner battle in our heads with the evil twin, because growth comes from tapping into your diamond in the rough and realizing what a perfect complement that tool is to your autopilot. But yeah, and your sixth function is the Joker. For me, that's NE. So the Joker, you are aware of the ways that the overindulgence of this function can trip other people up. You won't wish to fall victim yourself, and you'll be blind to the ways that you do fall victim to yourself unless you tap into your shadow. But the Joker can become a friend when you learn to be playful when using it. So the reason why it's a Joker is that, for me, NE is my sixth function. This function is the direct opposite to everyone's mental blind spot, which I'm going to get into next. My SI is very blind to me, but SI is the other side of the coin to NE. And so, similarly to how I explained the gilded coin, we can't really see this function clearly. And the reason why it can trip us up or trip other people up is because we don't fully understand it. Because we're missing a piece. If I don't understand SI at all, as much as I would find it fun to play with NE, it's gonna sort of surprise me at certain moments. It could trip me up. An example of this in me is that NE is really good at, making educated guesses about things and, being adaptable with things. And I'm highly critical of the ways that other people make too many assumptions, too many guesses. And I definitely see how too much of that can trip people up. And so, yeah, that's the Joker function. And then the seventh function is the mental blind spot. In the mental blind spot, you lack conscious control and understanding of this function. There's a tendency to view this function as irrelevant. This is very similar to the polar point of least resistance theory in socionics. I'm just using different terms. None of these ideas are really new. It's just my way of understanding them and expressing them. It's the idea that this is the deepest function into our subconscious. Our shadow is all subconscious, but we won't, of all the functions that we might realize might be good to tap into, this is pretty much the bottom of our list when it comes to interest. We tend to be annoyed or confused when society demands us to use this function. When we see other people using it, we might just kind of scratch our heads. It's not as much a overt judgment as it is more of a overlooking and confusion. Where the eighth function is the antagonist. This one is much more overt dissonance, where the mental blind spot is more just, like I said, overlooking. But the antagonist, when your function is in the antagonist position, you tend to see way more problems than solutions that come from those who use this function with ease. As the polar opposite of your autopilot, this function can seem to be against you or other in some way, and through integrating the shadow, you can learn to see the positives of this function and decide to either, one, outsource antagonists to help you with your problems, or two, mimic antagonist tactics. So for example, my antagonist function is extroverted thinking. For our antagonist functions, it really is, we're going to see everything they're doing as the polar opposite of what we do, because it goes completely against our autopilot, and it tends to naturally inhibit our autopilot. And so it does quite naturally set up obstacles to our ego and to our autopilot. But we have to learn that it is just as valid of a way to get the job done as your autopilot. And the way that the antagonist works is that if your autopilot is a judgment, your antagonist is also a judgment. If it's extroverted, it's also extroverted. If it's introverted, it's also introverted. but the feeling, thinking, or the sensing, intuiting, the type of function it is will be different. And so because our egos are so stretched out and so overinflated into our autopilot, our eighth function, our antagonist, is going to seem, we're like so stretched on the other end that it's like we're looking at them from polar opposites. And for self-growth, there needs to be a sort of mutual respect to that function. Realize they're doing pretty much the same thing that I'm doing, but just in a parallel way. They don't have to be against you. I will never really be able to, it's not really something that you should try and improve. That's why I said enlist them to help you. Because, for example, for me, ESTJs and ENTJs, they probably don't want to use the FE, as well. And so they'd rather have an FE user do it for them. I'd rather have TE users do TE for me. Or I can sort of learn from them, see what they're doing, and sort of mimic tools that I've learned from them. But I'm not going to really be the sort of person to come up with TE things on my own. So that is just an overview. I'm going to be doing videos about each of the function placements as well. If you want to be typed, me and my best friend Crystal, who's an ENFP, have our typing service that is available, and we use these 8 function model in our typing. And if you will get a full description of your type and 3 other types that you might be as well. All the details about how I do that is below. It's been really fun typing you all who have signed up already. I'm really excited to get to share more about how I'm seeing things and explaining it in the way that I see things. Like I said before a few times, none of this is really new. It's all just revamping what Carl Jung said, and while inspired by all the other theorists, it's new in the sense that I came up with these terms, but it's not new. I'm not the first person who have said things like this. So yeah, take that with a grain of salt. If you resonate with the way I'm explaining it, it's just a new way of explaining. I'm not trying to say that any other way that other people are doing are wrong, but I do think that certain people resonate with certain types of explaining more than others. So that's why I wrote this up, because it makes more sense to me than anything that I've read. So perhaps there's some of you out there who resonate with that. If you want to join my Facebook group, or if you want to apply for one-on-one mentoring, that's below as well. Any questions, let me know, and have a wonderful rest of your day.